Today, a majority of sales teams are already using more than one channel in their outbound efforts. They send emails, they make calls, they connect on LinkedIn, sometimes they leave voicemails. In some markets, they may also use things like SMS, WhatsApp, or other channels. But using more channels does not automatically mean you have a multi-channel outreach motion that is effective in generating pipeline. A lot of teams have what I would call disconnected outreach. The email says one thing, the call sounds like a different pitch, the LinkedIn message feels like a generic bump or just checking in. The voicemail asks for a call back, but does not connect to any of the messages that have been sent before by the seller. And from the buyer perspective, all of this can feel very ad hoc and non-relevant most of the time. That is the problem I want to tackle in more details in this video. I've created a full guide and a one-pager on how to approach multi-channel outreach more effectively. And I linked that in the description below. That one-pager and that guide goes much deeper into the structure and the examples, the cadence types, and the channel-specific guidance to make your outbound motion work. But in this video, I want to focus on how do you take a multi-channel outreach framework and apply inside a real sales organization without overcomplicating it. So let's start with the core idea. A multi-channel cadence should not be a pile of disconnected touches. It should be one coherent motion where each channel plays a distinct role and reinforces the same message, the same thread. In my guide, the model I propose breaks the channel's roles down very clearly. You have the email that carries the main observation, the problem, and the reason for reaching out. The phone is the thing that creates immediacy and tests whether the message resonates, whether your hypothesis may be onto something. LinkedIn, instead, is about building familiarity. And finally, you have voicemails that points back to the strongest message rather than trying to carry the whole pitch and say more words than is necessary. That is the logic that we work from. And it's not about how do we add more steps to what we're doing, but more about how do we make each step reinforce the same useful idea so that it can be as effective as it can possibly be. So if you're in enablement, sales leadership, RevOps, or just managing, for example, SDRs, this workthrough is really about helping the team move from activity-based sequences to a more coherent outbound execution. So where do we start? I think the first thing that I want to call out is a typical mistake, which is starting with the message in the sense that they open the sequence builder and ask, okay, what should email one says? But that's not the first question. The first question is always like, should this person enter a sequence or a cadence, which is like a multi-touch with different channels at all? That is very important because sometimes a cadence is not the best opening path. You should not be rolling anyone into a sequence. So if you have, for example, a credible mutual connection, this person may be a previous user, a former customer, or you might have seen a strong piece of prospect created content that you should instead engage in a very different way. You should start with a direct engagement that is extremely relevant, that has nothing to do with a sequence. So my guide goes quite in depth on the fact that sequencing should still earn its place. So before placing a prospect into a sequence, you need to check whether there is some leverage. Again, I'm from mutual connection, previous users, meaningful engagement that you can have on prospect-created content. Leverage is the thing that allows you to convert your opportunity in a more effective way with less volume and lower effort. So that's the first practical move. And then create a simple pre-cadence check for sellers and managers, essentially. So before someone launches a sequence, they should be able to answer, is there a warmer, stronger, or more relevant way to open this conversation? For example, imagine the prospect is a new sales enablement leader at a target account. If they used your product at their previous company, that is not the same as a cold outbound prospect. And a standard automated sequence may just weaken your chances to actually convert. Instead, in this case, you want to start through the previous relationship and build it from there. Or you might imagine a VP of sales that just published a thoughtful post about manager effectiveness. In that case, a manual note that engages with their point of view may be stronger than putting them straight into a generic cadence. So once the root decision is clear, whether you go or not go into a cadence, then the next move is to choose the cadence type. And again, assuming that you decided in this case that is the appropriate thing to do to put them through a cadence. In the guide, I simplify this cadence type idea into 3 buckets, which is basically high personalization, low personalization, and zero personalization. And it's a useful model because it stops the team from treating every prospect in the same way. So for example, high value account with a priority stakeholder should not receive the same level of effort as a lower priority account where you simply need structured coverage across multiple stakeholders in an efficient way. Equally, zero personalization does not mean ultimately zero relevance. It means the relevance has to come from segmentation rather than manual research. So that means there has to be some pre-work that has been done to be able to do that segmentation correctly so that you can still have a high level of automation, but in a way that is still targeted. So for the first implementation step, you don't want to rebuild every sequence you may have or just build all sequences from scratch. You want to pick one segment or one persona and one outbound situation. For example, you might have like RevOps leader in a high growth SaaS companies, might be like the main target. Then you also might have enterprise sales leaders hiring new AEs, or you might have as well like sales enablement leaders in tier 1 account that you've specified, or dormant opportunities with a known trigger. So all of these are potential like focus area, and you might start just from one of those and then build from there. Then you decide essentially what cadence type fits the situation. What I would say is that the smallest useful output in all of this is not a full playbook or a sequence library or a full sales engagement architecture. The smallest useful output is what I define a one-page cadence design brief. And essentially that is a working document that a seller, manager, and maybe enablement practitioner can complete before building or reviewing a cadence. The purpose is to slow the team down just enough to make the cadence coherent. And the brief should include 7 things. Number 1 is the target context. So who is this cadence for? For example, RevOps leaders in tier 1 SaaS accounts with recent enterprise hiring, which is in this case the trigger. Second is the route decision. Should this person enter a cadence or is there a better opening path? And that's where you check for mutual connection, previous user, previous customers, other relevant triggers, or content they have created. And for this, I highly recommend you investing as well in tools that are many today that allow you to surface this type of information without doing too much manual effort. Third, we talk about the cadence type. Is this a high, low, or zero personalization? And importantly, you want to define the why. For example, this is a low personalization because the account is a good fit, the persona is relevant, but there is no strong access path or urgent trigger to basically grant additional manual effort as a high personalization. Fourth is the core observation. So what we can notice about this particular target. And this is important because the observation becomes the anchor for the cadence. And I explained that in the model as well in the full one-pager and guide. For example, an observation might be noticed you are hiring several enterprise account executives across the UK team, if the UK, for example, is a regional focus. That type of observation is useful because it connects to a potential operational pressure, something that is changing the condition within the organization. Fifth, then we have the problem hypothesis that is obviously linked to the observation in some ways. So in this example, the hypothesis could be when enterprise hiring ramps quickly, right? Onboarding consistency and then pipeline creation often become harder to manage. That is much stronger than saying, for example, I saw your company is growing. This latter version is definitely too broad, and while the first version gives the cadence a practical thread and relevant hypothesis that can be right or could be also wrong, but it's okay because they can also correct you and still allow you to open up a conversation that you can explore. Sixth is the channel roles. Define what each channel will do. Email carries the main hypothesis in full. Phone tests whether the hypothesis is relevant. LinkedIn builds familiarity and asks a liked maybe contextual question, and voicemails points back to the strongest message. Seventh is the first 3 touches. That's the first thing you want to define. Only write the first email, the first call opener, and the LinkedIn touch. I would say that is enough, and you don't need to build immediately a 16-day sequence before you know whether the thread is strong and maybe working. It's something that you can immediately test with a potential prospect. So let's look at what this might look in practice. So the first email opens around enterprise hiring and the risk of uneven onboarding. So The call opener then uses the same observation, something along the lines of, "Hi Sarah, it's Federico from company X. I sent you a short note earlier because I noticed the enterprise hiring push across the team. The reason I reached out is that when hiring ramps quickly, onboarding consistently can become harder to sustain. I was curious whether there is something your managers are already seeing or whether it is too early." Now, the LinkedIn message then continues the same thread. "So the enterprise are in push and sent you a short note on something I've seen come up in similar teams. I'm curious if onboarding consistency is already on your radar." The team is no longer inventing a new angle for every channel. They are carrying one relevant idea through different formats. And this makes things much, much easier for the seller, but also obviously the buyer receives things in a more coherent and coordinated way, increases the chances of a response, whether you might be right or wrong with your hypothesis or observation. So the guide calls this one idea multiple reinforcement. In the one pager, the first touch provides the observation, then the call, then LinkedIn message, then voicemail, and follow-up email all reinforce like the same signal, essentially. That is what you're trying to operationalize in this approach. Now, let's talk about things that can really get in the way of this process. One of the first things that I often come across that is the cause of many problems is ownership. So multi-channel outreach often sits across many functions. So you might have sales that owns the activity, you have marketing that owns the messaging, you have RevOps that owns the system, enablements owns the training and readiness of the team, and then managers owns reinforcement and inspection. So everyone a piece of it, but no one owns the full quality of the motion. So what that happens, cadence design becomes very fragmented and the sequence exists, but no one is asking whether the buyer experiences in a coherent thread or whether anyway we are approaching things in a coordinated fashion. So it's very critical that ownership is clarified. There is some sort of like program manager or project manager that has full oversight of the whole process cross-functionally. The second issue is often weak account tiering. So the high, low, and zero personalization model only works if the team knows which account and stakeholder deserve more effort. If the tiering is unclear, seller will make poor decisions when it comes to resources and when they focus their time. They may spend too much time researching low-value accounts, or they may send generic automation to high-value stakeholders in very important accounts, when instead a different approach would have been much more effective. So the third issue is message fragmentation. And that is probably, I would say, the most common one and that we've already been touching on, right? Even when teams agree on the sequence structure, the messages might go all over the place because the email might be thoughtful, okay, but then the call opener might be completely generic and LinkedIn just say something like just bumping this here. Then the voicemail asks for a callback without putting forward the strongest message and without directing attention to any of the other touch points that have already been performed. So that means that it's important that if the team has to be doing some of the work that we're describing in this video in order to address that disconnectedness head-on. Then the fourth issue is, as in any change management initiative, is manager reinforcement. Manager often might inspect completion activity, if they're sending email, if they're making call, if they are sending enough LinkedIn messages, etc. And this is important, but at the same time, that's not enough because we need to look at the quality, right? So they should be looking at whether those touches make sense together. Also, manager need to coach on observation quality, how the problem is being framed, how people are opening the calls, because it's the most important part of the call itself, how they are following up on LinkedIn, and again, whether all of the steps in the sequence are actually adding context and value instead of just repeating the same ask or the same checking in. So if you don't do that, the cadence management in this outbound management process becomes just like activity compliance, which ultimately can create a lot of demoralization as well within the team. Then the fifth issue is about data and tool hygiene, because if persona fields are like poor, the account data is also like all over the place, job titles are outdated or other information about the persona are outdated, or segmentation is actually vague, coming back to the point of like tiers and verticals, etc. It becomes very hard to run relevant outreach at scale. And this gets worse and worse, especially as you become bigger and bigger. And that's why RevOps and sales operation support in general matters so much. And in the guide itself, I also talk about deliverability basics, because things like authentication automation, in clean data, having consistent sending, having emails with a certain structure that is light and not too heavy, and also regular review as well of the sequences and making sure that people can, for example, just unsubscribe very easily. This hygiene is critical in order for your channels, especially email in this case, like to work effectively. So I would highly recommend as well to review this part on deliverability because it's critical for the success of an outbound motion if email is one of the channel, when you are doing that across many sellers or even hundreds of sellers. And then there is the last point I want to make, which is again coming back to overcomplication. Teams may try to build too many cadences for too many personas with too many branches and too many conditional paths. And I made this mistake myself more than I like to admit. And I know for a fact that it becomes too much for sellers to utilize, too much for manager to obviously inspect, and too much, for example, RevOps and even enablement itself to maintain over time. So if something is harder to maintain, you should already know that you're probably going off track in relation to your maturity level and the resources you have available. So I would say to you that a single well-built cadence for one priority segment is often more useful than a large library of disconnected sequences that will become outdated in a few weeks. So now let's go beyond just implementation like hiccups, let's say, and let's think about as well, how do you adapt your approach to multi-channel depending on the situation you're in? All of the way you apply it really depends on your maturity, the structure of your team, and the level of operational support that you have around your commercial teams. So if you are in a lower maturity environment, as always, you want to keep it very simple. You don't want to start with complex automation, with A/B testing, or a full outbound operating model. You want to start, I would say to you, like with 3 rules, right? First, do not sequence everyone by default. And again, invest in something that allows you to identify warmer path to those prospects. Second, choose one of the 3 cadence types, which is high, low, and zero personalization, and defining clearly what that means and to what type of account and stakeholders those will apply. And third, you want to build the cadence around one observation that carry across the email, phone, LinkedIn, and voicemail to simplify the whole framework. That alone will improve drastically the quality of your motion and provide the right level of support for the team. If you are in a small company, sellers may not have support from operation, even data. In that context, the best use of the framework that I propose in the model is a lightweight checklist and a few examples that people can reuse as a reference point to build their outreach. And you want to focus on the first touch, the call opener, and the follow-up logic on, for example, LinkedIn and voicemail. And keep the cadence short enough the seller can execute it while still managing active opportunities, because that's another thing you will have to consider, which I'm not going deep in here, but you need to understand how many opportunities reps are expected to be in contact with and bring forward into the sales cycle. And based on that, you have to adjust capacity to make sure that people are not burning out, because also that is something that could get in the way of performance if people are stressed out, overwhelmed, and so forth. So if you are in a larger organization, the framework can become more part of a more formal outbound operating system, and I recommend, of course, going deeper into the guide directly. In general, we know that RevOps can help define the fields, the segments, the cadence rules, and the workflow logic within potentially even a sales engagement tool that you will have to implement. And then you have, of course, enablement that can train the team on frameworks for manual email. For example, in the guide, I propose what I call the OPSEP framework, which stands for observation, problem, solution, engagement, and PS, if you want to add that at the end as well. But training should also focus on how to do great cold calling and as well messages. Then managers in this kind of high maturity environment, is critical that they do sequence reviews every now and then and cone reviews to reinforce the best practice, the standard that has been defined as well together with RevOps and enablement. In an enterprise or ABM motion, you want to make sure you're increasing the manual depth of your messages. You want to use high personalization for priority stakeholders in priority account, but you want to apply, again, equally. So make sure that you set the rules of when high, low, or zero personalization may apply. Ultimately, the aim is to concentrate the highest effort and the highest judgment where it can change the outcome drastically and where actually can contribute meaningfully to the revenue of the organization. If you are having high volume outbound, it's very different, of course, and you might need to use more zero personalization, but that only works if your segmentation is strong. The practical focus should be persona-specific messaging, clean data, simple email that are direct and get straight to the point, and clear rules when a seller should, for example, step in after engagement if you're running like ABR automation. If a prospect replies then or visits a high intent page, accepts a connection request, or another stakeholder starts getting involved in the motion, for example, things will also change, and you should adapt the process to these specific signals as well. Now, another thing to say is that channel mix also depends on your market. Right? If phone performance is strong, you want to give calls more weight, and this means you want to provide more support to people around that. In the guide as well, you have a simple call structure that I propose where you want to open with clear context, you want to pause, you want to check familiarity with them, then you want to ask for permission to be able to add additional value or context. And then at that point, once you get the permission, you can go into conveying your hypothesis and ask for an open question to try and get the conversation going. If phone connection rates are low, LinkedIn and email may carry more of the motion, of course, but the principle stays the same. The exact number of steps can obviously change. The channel order can change. The level of personalization can change. But what should not change is always the core thread. Every channel should reinforce the same relevant idea once you've identified what this idea is, which is, when I say idea, I'm referring always about the mix of observation and the hypothesis that you're carrying around the problem that these people may be having in these specific accounts. Now, if you were to ask me, okay, what's the, Federico, next step I could take from this? And I would say the simplest next step is to run 30-minute Cadence coherence review on a live sequence that you may have just built or that has been running already. Right? Don't do like the full review of your outbound motion. Just pick one active cadence and review 5 specific things. First, is there a clear reason this prospect should be in a sequence rather than approach through a warmer path? I've repeated this many times already, but I think it's such an important point that many organizations miss, and I want to make sure that this is the first question you should be asking yourself. Then secondly, you're asking, is the cadence high, low, zero personalization? Have we even define that aspect in the first place? Third is what is the core observation or hypothesis? So really looking at that, are we actually leading with an observation and an hypothesis? Fourth, do the first email, the call open and LinkedIn touch and voicemails, but if you are using that to reinforce the same idea or they're all disconnected from each other. And fifth, does each follow-up add clarity, context, or value, or does it only ask again? Or like check-in, for example. And you can capture this in a simple table once you do the review. So you have a table that says, for example, like touch, current message, role of the touch, does it reinforce the core idea, and what needs to change if there is anything you will modify, right? For example, you might find that the first email is built around enterprise hiring, but then the call opener, when you listen to a rep has called the same account, says simply, oh, we help sales teams improve productivity. Like, there is a mismatch there, and this is very generic. So the fix is to rewrite the call opener so it reinforces the same hiring trigger and tests the same problem hypothesis. Or another thing you might find is that the LinkedIn messages say something like, oh, just following up here as well. Again, that does not help. You want to make sure that you are rewriting things with more context. Like you're saying something along the lines of, oh, saw the enterprise hiring push and sent you a short note on something I have seen coming up in similar teams. Curious if onboarding consistency is already on your radar. So the goal of the review is, one, improve the sequence thread rather than a full transformation. You want to have a better example. You want to curate a better example. The managers, sellers, and other teams that might be relevant in this case can point to and reuse as a reference point so that people know what is the good standard. And I feel like this is one of the biggest problems in organization where standards are not clearly defined. As a result of that, if you don't have a good example of what good looks like, reps may be guessing, and even if you are do training, like in a theoretical sense, like still you won't move the needle because again, reps won't know when they're doing a good job or not. If I were to summarize, the core takeaway from this video is simply that you should not design multi-channel outreach as a set of separate touches. Instead, you should design it as one coherent thread. Email, phone, LinkedIn, and voicemail should not compete with each other. Instead, they should complement each other, carrying forward a useful idea that can trigger a response from the buyer and anyway advance the conversation. So once again, if you want to go deeper, the full guide and one-pager are linked below. They include the different cadence types that we discussed, the OPSEP framework that I referred for emails, the different channel examples and how to approach them, LinkedIn and cold calling tips as well, deliverability basics, and all of the visual models that support this work through. You want to use those as a deeper reference point, especially if you are like moving towards a more high maturity environment, but you can adapt it to your context as well. So to start, again, remember, pick one live cadence, identify what is the core observation for that specific segment and persona you're focused on, and check that every touch that you're leveraging reinforces the same idea. So thank you for staying with me all the way through, and I hope you found this useful. I'll see you in the next video.